and welcome back. Let's take a look at what's going on in Ukraine now as our first conflict of interest. So first of all, let's take a look at Novokalinova, and all the really update there is around out here is just that Russian forces are pushing a bit further north towards the town out here in the Avdiivka direction. And something I found pretty of note is that I looked all around here to see if I could find the Storm Z penal unit, as we've talked about a bit prior, that they are essentially the new Wagner that's going to be out here, and I had assumed that they would be using them to push further into Avdiivka, but they seem to be more or less sitting it out here, and so the Donetsk area. So I'm wondering as to why that is. I'm assuming the only conclusion that I could come to is that perhaps they're sitting it out right now, and around maybe perhaps January, February, or maybe later in December, when Russia, I'm assuming, is probably going to go on another offensive, sort of like they did last year near Volodar. They're going to, and also Bakhmut too, they're going to try and completely encircle and take Avdiivka, and they're going to pretty much try and use, of course, Storm Z as their main manpower usage out here to, like they did with Wagner last year and earlier this year as well. Just pretty much throwing men and material at it, which I'm assuming is probably what they're going to do. What they're probably doing is just racking up as many men and material in this unit as possible, and then they're just going to throw it all at Avdiivka. So, yeah, anyways, let's take a look at kind of what's going on the ground out there. So as for what's going on out here, to be precise, of course, there's a lot of footage coming out of Avdiivka, and this is such an instance out here. This is coming out of Stepova, which is north of Avdiivka. It's pretty much, one of those villages that is around Avdiivka and where Russia is pushing pretty hard in trying to encircle the city. So this is a building that is almost completely blown out and, as we can see, reduced to mostly rubble out here. And what is being reported is that there are Russian units that were hiding in here, and later in this clip we see that they are targeted by a drone. So the reason why I wanted to bring this up is that, as we've talked about previously, Russian units seem to be using a lot of burned out and destroyed equipment as places to hide. So as to why that is specifically, I would be really interested to know the exact reason as to perhaps the sudden change in doctrine, or rather also release of footage or showing of footage of Russians using, destroyed BMPs, BTRs, tanks as, halfway points to hide. Although it does make sense, considering that, if such and such, BTR is completely blown out and destroyed from a mine, you're relatively certain that the tracks that it took, to get to that point are safe of mines up until that point. So, it's interesting to see how it's seemingly changed uh, in terms of what we see out there. But anyways, let's take a look at Israel. Okay, now taking a look at what's coming out of Israel out here. Number one, of course, just talking about the Gaza Strip, there is no change considering the ceasefire that's going on right now. All that's really happening is, of course, aid that's coming into Gaza, and as well as the hostages that are being released out there. And also, also of note, all I really saw was just a little bit of shelling earlier today that was being reported, or at least yesterday. But other than that, nothing else is going on in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel. But there is a lot of action going on in the West Bank, as we can see here. Seemingly people who are being wounded and casualties by gunfire in the West Bank, as well as arrests and storming of certain camps within West Bank. So, you know, this is probably the most amount of action we've seen, even considering the ceasefire that's going on. You would think that, there would perhaps be a less action going on, but there seems to be a lot that's being announced in this area. So, it's something definitely to keep an eye on in terms of what this might amount to and what it might turn to. But other than that, what else I really wanted to touch on is that perhaps it is a certain media bias, but in terms of the footage that's coming out here, like the hostage exchanges as well as the prisoner releases that are going on, most of what I'm seeing are just the hostages being released, of Israelis being reunited with their families and whatnot. But we aren't really seeing too much footage, at least being shown. Obviously it's out there. There's a lot out there of it, but it's not being as reported of the prisoners being released by Israel. So, as to why that is, I'm assuming that, most people are probably more sympathetic to hostages being released than, prisoners being released. But anyways, what else I really want to touch on is that, considering the hostages that are being released are not always all Israelis. Sometimes they are foreign workers, because as we know, as we talked about previously, there are a lot of farms sort of in this area. So what I understand is that some of the people who were taken were farmhands and who are not Israeli, nor are they Israeli citizens, and a lot of them are actually from Thailand, from what I understand. And the reason why uh, they're here is because they're of course working here to you know uh, earn their wage and then eventually come back to their country, as one article was reporting, in terms of a woman who was waiting for her boyfriend to come home because he was one of the hostages. So anyways, that's really all that's being reported in terms of the map. Let's take a look at what's going on the ground. All right, so taking a look at some of this footage that's coming out here, what this is of Israeli troops clearing out certain buildings as well as tunnels out here. And what I really wanted to talk about was that what this seems to be are further clearing operations, as we talked about previously, of the area that Israel already holds of the West Bank. So yeah, as we can see, a clearing dog trying to, as we've seen in previous clips as well, them using dogs to clear out, not necessarily militants, but to sniff out for, of course, bombs and traps and whatnot. So what this mainly is of course just Israeli troops clearing the territory that they've already held of the Gaza Strip. So, what this really amounts to is that I don't think there is going to be more hostilities between Hamas and Israel, of course, until the hostages are fully either exchanged or the ceasefire comes to an end. So, I think that the ceasefire is going to be honored for the most part, but um, as per what Netanyahu says, is that once this is over, once the ceasefire is over, they're just going to get right back to it. Like, the war isn't over; it's just a temporary, of course, ceasefire. So, anyways, that's really all this clip had to show. Let's take a look at another conflict of ours. So this is just some footage of an attack by the MNDAA on, of course, Myanmar Army outpost in Laokang, or outside Laokang, in the outskirts of it. So this footage is not necessarily showing anything too crazy, but what I really want to talk about here is that, I don't like to really report on rumors. I only like to use sources that are completely, factual, and such as, Ukraine. A lot of the maps that I will use are, you know, sources that are completely verified, and I don't like to use sources that are not as verified, or from, a Telegram channel that's run by one guy, stuff like that. But anyways, I have heard something and I've seen that perhaps there is going to be another operation going on in Myanmar, sort of like Operation 1027, but now Operation 1127. And, as to what it may amount to, apparently it is going to be a nationwide operation out there. So, it of course it is a rumor, but if this turns out to be true, we know Operation 1027 was really, really big, and they're having a lot of success out there, as we can see. But if 1127 is going to be completely nationwide, since Operation 1027 was mostly restricted to, a couple states out there in Myanmar, but if this is completely nationwide, and we've seen action going on all throughout Myanmar, we've talked about northern, eastern, western, southern Myanmar, and if this is going to be something that's going to amount to, all of Myanmar, it's definitely going to be a really, really big deal if it turns out to be true. So talking about Sudan out here really quick, I got a report out here that says that the RSF is announcing complete control over Darfur in terms of military access and military sites. So, it's definitely concerning, considering that, this conflict has, spread pretty much all throughout Sudan, and especially as we talked about, Khartoum and Omdurman out there, which are, some of the biggest cities out there in all of Sudan, considering that one of them is the capital city. So this conflict is something that's not being reported on as much in the news, but it's affecting so many people out there. It's affecting an entire country, and the spillover could be quite huge. But it's of course an area that has been riddled with strife for quite a while. So people aren't necessarily as inclined, especially in places like Africa. People just don't really care, unfortunately. But it's important to talk about that, the RSF is seemingly gaining a lot of ground out there, and it's concerning. All right, so last thing, touching on Ukraine, right before we wrap up, we got a report just a little bit ago about 79 combat engagements with Russian forces, which is a lot. That is probably the most we've seen in a few weeks. And if we take a look at Oryx here in a second, we'll see what that's come out to for both sides. All right, so last thing I want to talk about out here is that Ukraine and their equipment losses, they were sitting at 4,725, and now they're at 4,761, which is definitely a lot considering, the reports that we've been seeing previously, although this is definitely more in line with probably what we'd be expecting considering the huge uptick as we just saw in Russian activity out there. And taking a look at Russia's equipment losses, they were sitting at 13,152, and now they're sitting at 13,236, which is an eye-watering amount. That is a lot of equipment losses for the amount that they are fighting for. And if you've been following at all, you would see that in this map has barely changed. This map has barely changed in the past few days in terms of just a few 100 meters a day, maybe. So just losing tens, if not 100 pieces of equipment in just a few days is really, really concerning for the Russians. All right, now before I wrap up here, I really wanted to bring up that if you have any resources considering, Myanmar or Sudan or any other conflicts that we have touched upon a little bit, I would really, really appreciate it being shared because I would really like to talk about it since, Myanmar does not have any map resources. The only thing that I could come up with is actually this resource, which will show, of course, Israel, as we can see, as well as Ukraine out here, and they have one for Myanmar, which we can probably take a look at if we can find it. Yeah, we can see Myanmar out here, and they have it, but of course it's updated every few days, and it doesn't actually show who controls what. So if there is any, or if there are any resources that has Myanmar or perhaps any other conflicts such as Sudan or whatnot, I would be really, really glad to talk about it out there. But anyways, if you got any comments, leave them down below. And other than that, thanks for watching, everyone.